about America. And you begin to see how much Abraham Lincoln loved America and how he understood America. And this got me thinking in a way such that finally I decided I needed to write about what I had discovered about what is America. And I found that, in fact, up until fairly recently, I wasn't so clear on what America is. I wasn't clear at all on what religious liberty was and on how faith and freedom fit together. And when I really discovered this, again with Os Guinness's help in his book, I was so staggered that I said, I've got to get this book, if you can keep it, into the hands of everyone I possibly can. At my own expense, I sent a copy to every member of Congress and every senator, because the message of this book is so foundational to who we are as a people. Let me backtrack. Because America is an idea, because we're not an ethnic group, we are an idea. We buy into an idea. And if we are an idea, and if we the people don't buy into that idea and understand that idea, we become America in name only. And if you become America in name only, you're dead. America is dead. So I started to understand this, and I got so excited. And I'll start with the title of the book. The title of the book is If You Can Keep It. How many people know where that comes from? All right. The rest of you, big trouble. You're going to have to listen carefully. The ones who raised your hand, if you want to take a cigarette break, go ahead. Feel free. But I want to tell you, when I understood this, it just lit me up. In 1787, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin, the oldest member of the convention, is leaving Independence Hall. It's all over. And what had happened in that building over 100 days in that hot summer in Philadelphia, and the building, of course, is still there, was secret. Nobody really knew. There were no leaks in those days. They weren't invented until fairly recently. But nobody knew what had happened in that room. And the backstory, some of you know this, some won't, but imagine no one ever governed themselves in the history of the universe. Do you know that? Do you understand that self-government on the American model is not supposed to exist? It never existed in the history of the world until 1776. Did you know that? How rare and insane American-style liberty is? It is a rare, fragile flower. We don't deserve it. No one on the planet deserves it, and no one ever had it. And now we have it, and we hardly know what it is. We hardly appreciate it. In 1776, some people had this wild idea that we could govern ourselves. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would they have the arrogance or the ignorance to think that if nobody ever governed themselves in the history of the world, that they should be able to do it? Now, I'm Greek. Greeks say, oh, we invented democracy. I'm proud to be Greek, and yeah, sort of we invented democracy, but there is nothing in Athens or in the city-states of ancient Greece that begins to compare with what we're talking about in 1776. There is simply nothing on the scope, on the model, nothing. They're just flickers compared to the bonfire of freedom that comes in 1776. Some people figure this out, that if we have checks and balances and so on and so forth, we will be able to govern ourselves. Okay, well, how did it go? They win the war in 1783, and for the next 4 years, it doesn't go so well. Now, again, some of you know the story. Well, why didn't it go so well? It didn't go so well because the federal government wasn't strong or big enough. Even imagine that was a problem. Just try to imagine, okay? It wasn't big enough. Well, they go back to the drawing board in 1787. They go into Independence Hall to see if it is possible to do what has never been done in the history of the world. In fact, it hadn't been going so well. I just said that. It hadn't been going so well. And many people genuinely didn't know whether it was possible. It's so easy for us to sit here and think like, well, of course it's possible. We've been doing it for 240-some years. Back then, no one had ever done it, and they had no idea if they'd be able to pull it off. And by some miracle, and I don't use that word metaphorically, they leave in 100 days, and somebody asks Dr. Franklin, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? Now, I always thought that's a cute question, because obviously it's a republic. Well, no. Once I did the research, I understood they didn't know if anyone could actually pull it off. No one had ever pulled it off. And this woman, Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia, says to Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? We've heard about this republic idea. We've heard about self-government, but we know it's not working so well. What did you come up with in there? George Washington was in there. All the big guns came back. And maybe they've given us a soft monarchy. Maybe they couldn't pull off a republic. So she asks, and Dr. Franklin says to her, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And we always think that that's so cute and witty. It's Franklin, the Yankee wit. But do you understand what he said? It's a prophetic statement. We have been given a republic, something so glorious and so fragile and so amazing and so rare in history, rare today, unfortunately. And he said, it's a republic, man. We've given you a republic. If you can keep it, you, meaning you, the people, will be entrusted with keeping it. If you don't keep it, it goes away. It's not going to exist on a piece of paper. Piece of paper, think about it. A few black marks on a piece of paper, what does it mean? Nothing. Unless the people understand it, live it, and keep it. And Franklin understood that, and I think he understood that there is no doubt that you might not keep it. There is no doubt that it might not last. He didn't live many years after that, did he? He lived 3 years after this. He had no idea what history would say. Well, I'm here to say that I think it's miraculous we've kept it as long as we have, but if he came back today, he'd be blown away that it's still here, and he'd be blown away that it's on the verge of going away forever. Because for the last 50 years or so, we have ceased to understand what I finally understood late in life when I wrote this book. How it works, what it is, and how we can keep it. And that if we don't, it definitely goes away. It doesn't maybe go away. We are the republic. If we govern ourselves and understand how and what it means, then this fragile, glorious thing, which is meant for the whole world, not just for us in America, I hope you know that. God blesses us to be a blessing, not to hoard the blessing to ourselves, to be a blessing, to share it, hoping that the whole world would become free as we are free, including in China, including in every part of the world where people are no different than we are. And so I began to understand that Franklin saw this and that I never heard this. I'm in my 50s. I never heard this growing up, not in public schools, not anywhere else. I realized we've ceased to teach this from the 60s onward. In the book that Os Guinness writes, the most central concept, which is a chapter in my own book, is something he calls the golden triangle of freedom. This is the magic that the founders understood that gives us self-government. Listen to this because it is so brilliant. It's like E equals MC squared. It's so simple, it's so elegant, it's magnificent, and it's true. Here's what it is. I'll say it quickly, and then I'll explain it. The golden triangle of freedom is that freedom requires virtue. Have you ever heard that? Some of you might have heard it, but you're not going to hear it in public school. Founders understood it. I'll explain it in a minute. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith, in turn, requires freedom. Let me explain it. This is what every one of the founders understood. This is how it works. There's no other way that it can work. Here it is. Liberty, which is self-government. If you are free, you are free not to be governed from without, not to be governed from above, but free to govern yourself. Free to govern ourselves. We're free. Okay, in order to be free to govern yourself requires virtue. Every one of the founders knew that in order to govern yourself requires you have to have virtue. Why don't I steal when nobody's looking? Well, if I have virtue, I won't steal. I don't need a cop with a gun to keep me from stealing. I answer to a higher authority that has nothing to do with the government. Well, the founders all saw this. They said that when people have virtue, even if it's just civic virtue, they will do the right thing when nobody's looking. That kind of people can govern themselves. That kind of people can be free. A virtuous people only can be free. The founders wrote about it. Every one of them wrote about it. I'm not just talking about a few of the Christian founders. Every one, Ben Franklin, Jefferson, every one of them understood you cannot have self-government and liberty without virtue. And then they understood the next part of the triangle. You cannot have virtue without faith. Imagine that. Now, they didn't say that you can't have any kind of virtue without faith, but they said, by and large, for people to govern themselves, there has to be a culture of virtue, and a culture of virtue we have seen with our eyes, okay, the founders had seen it, that where faith is strong, where religion is strong, people tend to have virtue. It's just one of those things. They observed it, they knew it, and they knew, and Tocqueville writes about it 50 years later, that somehow these things go together. That when you have people who answer to a higher authority, to the God of Scripture typically, somehow they're virtuous, somehow you don't need as many cops, you don't need as many laws. They govern themselves, they can be free. But then we're all tempted to say, well, if that's how it works, so let's legislate that everybody has to go to church, or everybody has to do this, or have 3 quiet times or something. We'll put it in and it'll just go forever. Well, the founders understood, this is the key to the whole thing, that actual faith must be free. It cannot be coerced. Whenever it is coerced or government sponsored, it just dies. We all know this. There's 100 stories. If you're forced to go to church, your body might be forced to go, but your soul doesn't have to go, your brain doesn't have to go. If you are forced to do something, if the state says this is our religion, it becomes a pro forma activity. But when it is free, when people do it because they want to, something happens and it comes alive. And there's really a free market of ideas, because then you can go to whatever church you like. If you're not getting anything there, you can go there. It's an amazing concept. And the founder said, faith must be free. Separation of church and state will have religious liberty. We cannot establish a religion. It is utterly free. And round it goes. And when I saw this, I understood that how come I've never heard what seems so clear to me right now? That you cannot really have self-government and liberty on the American model without that thing that every single one of the founders understood. Without virtue that's fueled by faith. And that you can't have real faith unless the faith is free. And I thought to myself, this is like a magic formula. All the founders understood it. They wrote about it. They didn't call it the Golden Triangle of Freedom. Os Guinness did. But it's the same concept. They all understood it. It is at the core of our democracy. And I would say it's at the core of all true freedom. You cannot have our kind of freedom without this. And I thought to myself, if that's true, which I know it is, Abraham Lincoln certainly knew that it was all those years later, then you have to say, well, why aren't we teaching this in our schools? This is like a math problem or science, or H2O is water. There's no other way to get water. If you can find it, you'll make a lot of money. But no one has ever found it. And so we teach in schools, 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, this makes water. This is not like opinion. Well, what I'm telling you, if you're studying the history of America and the history of world civilizations, this is not opinion. This is absolutely accepted fact by all of the founders. I'll say it again, all of the founders. And so the question is, why have we not been teaching this in our schools? And then the other question is, what was it about the American people all through history that suddenly they could pull this off? Well, it's many things, but one of the things has to do with a little thing called the First Great Awakening. In the 18th century, a man named George Whitefield came across from England. And he was an evangelist, and he preached like a maniac up and down the colonies, effectively for 30 years. He preached so much, and this is pure evangelism. I'm not talking a lot of teaching, a lot of sidebars, pure evangelism, that we must accept Jesus as Lord, okay? He's free to do that. He does it up and down the colonies. The established churches, of course, hate him a little bit because he's sucking away some of their parishioners because he was a good speaker. Folks, what happened was that revival broke out around the 13 colonies. It started in Philadelphia, where the young Benjamin Franklin was, and Franklin saw it first. He was never big on religion himself, but he saw empirical evidence that when people get that religion, virtue goes up, crime goes down, the ability to govern oneself and be free goes up. He saw that that's how it should work. 30 years of George Whitefield preaching up and down. So many people have been exposed to George Whitefield, and this is also not taught in schools. It's obviously in my book, if you can keep it, but he became effectively the patron saint of the 13 colonies. So much so that soldiers on the way to Quebec, actually it was Benedict Arnold before he flipped, Benedict Arnold took his troops to the grave of George Whitefield and cut off pieces of the dead man's clothing as a relic, because this man was considered to have embodied America. He was an evangelist. That's how powerful he was as a cultural figure. And if you think about it, the number of people who heard him preach is so staggering. In the 30 years that he preached, it is figured that 80% of all the colonists living in the 13 colonies heard him preach in person at least once. He was the only true celebrity of the era. He was such a wild celebrity that, as I say, when he died, he was like a secular saint of America. Because when he preached this idea of faith in a God, and you listen to him, not to the lawyers, to the politicians, and you listen to God. It's a phenomenal idea, and it made 1776 possible. What I'm telling you are facts. These things are no longer taught. Very basic stuff. Very basic stuff. And so at the heart of our liberty is the idea of God, the idea of faith, the idea of virtue. These things are inextricably intertwined. There is no way to get American-style self-government without those things. We can quibble about details. But anybody who thinks that you can have freedom the way we have it, without people who believe in God, without people who have reverence for the idea of virtue and teaching young people virtue, and reverence for the government. We are the government. It's a sacred trust. Without that, it doesn't work. And of course, I don't need to tell you, you just watch the TV, there are zillions of people who don't get this today, and zillions of politicians who don't get this today. There are senators, octogenarian senators, who don't understand these things. Feinstein. They don't understand the idea of religious liberty. Folks, if you don't understand religious liberty and the golden triangle of freedom and how faith has to be free, if you don't get that, and you're kind of annoyed that somebody's Christian faith is too strong, and when Amy Barrett, when Dianne Feinstein starts rebuking her, the dogma is strong within you. You're pretty Christian. I don't know. That makes me uncomfortable. It should make you unbelievably comfortable, Senator, because it's people like that that believe in higher values, that believe in loving their enemies. The Roman times, when people saw that Christians made the best citizens. You can hate Christians. You don't need to be a Christian, but you'd have to be blind not to see, as Benjamin Franklin did, that they make good citizens. They believe in self-government. This is at the heart of our democracy, folks. We've not teach. And what goes along with this, that's at the heart of America, what's at the heart of America is this idea that we are a nation for others. When we say make America great, when we say America first, we don't mean everyone else can go to hell. What we mean is we want to be great and strong and powerful so we can bless others, so we can open the gates and let millions of people put your mask on first. Why? Because you don't care if that kid dies? No, because you care. You need to take care of yourself so you can take care of him. Well, America has always been that. John Winthrop in 1630 is quoting Jesus, calling this place a shining city on a hill. Why is it a shining city on a hill? What's Jesus talking about? He's talking about a shining city on a hill that's seen from a distance, and people look and they go, what is that? I want that. That's beautiful. Can we have that someday? Can I go there someday? We want to be a model to the world of something beautiful that is God's idea, that as far as I'm concerned, comes out of the gospel, that comes out of the Bible. The idea of freedom is embedded in the Bible, and through history it works itself out, and here we are, and it's beautiful. And if we are blessed with freedom, we are blessed to be a blessing, not to hoard it to ourselves, but to take such good care of it that we can offer it to others, and that other people around the world will see it and say, I want that. I want a government like that. I want leaders like that. That is what God has called us to. And Lincoln said that we were God's almost chosen people. Lincoln said that because he knew that there was something spectacular about what God had done in history in creating this nation. And it's not ours to screw up. It's not ours to hoard to ourselves. It's a sacred trust. And what is more beautiful than that? What's more exceptional than the idea that we say we're not exceptional, except that we want to bless others with this thing that makes us exceptional. We want to give it away. And we have done that through history. We have sent our young men to foreign shores to die. We have done things around the world that aren't normal, that aren't in the interests of, just our interest. It's something beautiful, and that's what this country has always been. And it comes out of this idea. That is what America is. And we need to know it, and we need to teach it. We need to know it, and we need to teach it. And you have to think, we have today people, like this coach in the NBA who clearly don't understand this, folks. We're living at a time where leaders, wealthy adults, don't understand this idea. They don't understand that if you are blessed with freedom, the only reason you've been blessed with it is because you need to use it to speak up for those who don't have it. If you are in China being persecuted for your faith, if you're a Uyghur Muslim or a Buddhist or Falun Gong or any of these people being horribly persecuted in a totalitarian dictatorship, wouldn't you want those rich, free Americans to join you and to cry out to the world and to praise what's happening in Hong Kong and to denounce what's happening in the Chinese government? and having people say, you know what, if I can make an extra buck, I'm not going to say a thing. Can you imagine, folks? We've got to be better than that. We don't deserve to be free, folks. It is a gift. It is a gift. And this fragile, glorious gift God has given us to use for those who don't yet have it. There are people around the world looking to us. You remember when Ronald Reagan, speaking like a prophet of God, said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Everybody in the State Department said, you can't say that. Over and over and over, you can't say that. We might lose money, we might lose this. He said, I don't care, it's true. And he said it, and the demons trembled. They heard that the President of the United States of America said that, and they knew there was hope. We need to know that what we have is a sacred trust from God, and that if God has given us freedom, if He has given us anything, He's given it us for those who don't have it. So we need to teach our children and remind ourselves what we have is one of the most spectacular things in the history of the world. God has given it to us for His purposes in history. We must keep it, learn how to keep it. We must think about how to keep it. And we must know what about it is sacred. Why the imposition, for example, of something like same-sex marriage on churches is an abomination, not to Christians, but to America. It is a fundamentally un-American idea. If we don't understand these things, we don't deserve them. And honestly, all these things are why I have said that Donald Trump is a great president, not because I agree with everything he's ever done, but because he understands these kinds of things. And when people point out things he's done that aren't so great, I like to bring up a certain Christian value that a lot of people forget. It's called forgiveness. To love people where they are, not to demand that they agree with us on everything. I think that's the most important Christian value, and we need to practice it with all of our enemies. When people see that love, they don't know what to do with it. It touches them, it changes them. America has always represented that around the world to all kinds of people, to people that we've defeated, that we have treated with grace and love in defeat. And you remember when Lincoln said that about the South. He wanted to treat them with dignity, not to crush them. That is what God wants us to do and who He wants us to be. That's what it is to be a proud American. God bless you. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Dr. Frank Simon. I'm an allergist and family doctor, board certified in both allergy and internal medicine. I specialize in allergy, headaches, sinus, hives, cough, asthma, hypertension, and diabetes. We're located at 1404 Browns Lane near Norton Suburban Hospital. Our phone number is 895-5088. We can see you tomorrow.
From that point on, I decided that I would be a pro-life advocate. So I dedicated my life in the legislature. I'm going to run one more term. There's some legislation that we have not been able to finish because we have a governor who is not pro-life. He took everything we've done, so we're going to work on that legislation. So I'm dedicated my next term, if I'm re-elected, to making sure that we do everything we can to save those babies' lives.
Thank you so much for that. Next question for you all. We saw that video, the map, with a lot of the legislative developments, not all of them, across the country. All of your states, in recent months, over this past year or so, there have been some significant things happening at the legislative level on this issue specifically. So could you unpack that specifically for us? What action has the legislature been doing, and what has your role been in that? Senator De La Cruz, if we can start with you again.
Thank you. I wanted to write them down because legislation did several things. First, it eliminated any meaningful restrictions on post-viable abortions, post-viability. Now abortions can be performed for undefined reasons, health undefined, which could really include mental health, familial health, financial health, or emotional health. Eliminate any constitutional restrictions on the methods of abortion, and also any penalties for experimenting on human fetuses. One of the pieces of the legislation also diminished the role of the Department of Health and making it so that the Department of Health couldn't adopt abortion-specific health and safety regulations. So I submitted an amendment. It would clear up the language so that those and this could be adopted. So I called the Department of Health. I said, I'd like the last 10 years of inspections for Planned Parenthood. And she said, well, that's easy, there's only 2. But they're supposed to be inspected every year. And on the floor I said, Planned Parenthood's motto is to be safe, legal, and rare. Then it was safe and legal. Can we really call it legal if we're putting language into our legislation that prevents the inspection of a facility that performs surgical and chemical procedures? Can we really say we care about women when restaurants are held to a higher standard of cleanliness? Is it true that McDonald's is going to be held to a higher standard than these clinics that provide care for our women? Safe, legal, and rare. Now it's just come to the point where it's just legal. Unfortunately, my amendment did not pass, but I will continue to fight for this legislation. Lastly, what did the legislature do? Well, Common Cause Rhode Island, which is more of a left-leaning watchdog group, it was unprecedented what the Senate did. We had 2 bills, the House and the Senate bill, which mirrored each other. The first time the Senate bill died 5-4 in committee, and then they made some minor tweaks, which they said were substantial changes, which were not. The House bill was brought back to the Senate Judiciary. There were enough votes again to kill that bill in committee. And seconds before an up or down vote, they decided to switch it to another committee. Now, bills do move from committee. If they come to judiciary and they're not meant to be there, then we move them. That's when we receive the bill, not seconds before an up or down vote. What happened was they didn't have the votes, and so come hell or high water, they were going to make sure that that bill was sent to Health and Human Services, which has always been heard in judiciary, where 7 of the 9 members were self-professed liberals or progressives. So we have a fight in Rhode Island, and elections have consequences. We need to hold our elected officials accountable.
Louisiana held as the number 1 pro-life in the union. Honestly, Louisiana doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. 2/3 of our legislature are pro-life, and so we've been able to push very meaningful legislation. We just had Senator Milkovich to author and pass the heartbeat bill with no exceptions besides to help the life of the mother. And Governor Edwards signed it into law about 3 or 4 months ago. Prior to a majority vote, but we had an overwhelming majority vote in favor of that bill in both chambers. We also right now have the Love Life Amendment. We call it the Love Life Amendment. That was my bill that I authored, working with the Family Research Council, the Right to Life in our state, and everyone else, which is going to give all voters for the first time an opportunity to vote on whether Louisiana is pro-life. It's going to put language in our Constitution that says that Louisiana is a pro-life state. And that actually comes up during the 2020 presidential election. So the first our constituents will get to vote on the issue that we always vote on as elected officials. If you want to learn more about that amendment, the website is lovelifevoteyes.com. Lovelifevoteyes.com. And so we are looking at this right now to make sure our constituency is informed and ready to vote in 2020 to place that in our Constitution. Also, I authored the Admitting Privileges Bill. In our state, our Admitting Privileges Bill was upheld by the 5th Circuit. It's going to be heard at the United States Supreme Court. But what Louisiana has done is we understand until it's overturned that Roe versus Wade is right now the law. And so what we've done over the last 20, 30, 40 years is pass meaningful legislation that placed every restriction on abortion that we could. A lot of those laws have been upheld. We have a 24-hour waiting period. We can't perform an abortion up to a certain time in Louisiana. And of course, with the heartbeat bill, ours doesn't go into effect until Alabama or Mississippi goes into effect. We put a provision in the law because we are right now litigating a number of cases that I just mentioned. And so we partnered with our neighboring state to litigate that issue. And when they litigated, whatever the outcome is for theirs, that will be the outcome for ours. So that's what our state has been doing. And every year, in the state of Louisiana, we come together. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, Democrat, or Republican. It doesn't matter if you're from a rural area or urban area. We come together as a supermajority of the legislature with a Democratic governor who's pro-life. And we pass legislation that saves lives. And we do it not ignoring our constituency, but educating our constituency and bringing them along with us. And that's why the Love Life Amendment for us is so important. Because they've always said in the national media, well, you've done it as a legislature, but how do your constituents feel about it? Well, we know that our constituents are holistically pro-life. And so for the first time in 2020, they'll get to say that. And when we are talking about it on the floor, I think we advocate for those back home. In 2020, they'll advocate with us. It will be resounding in the Louisiana Constitution that Louisiana is constituents.
Thank you. When I came in, we were in the minority. The Republicans were in the minority. And in 2010, we actually got a governor, a House, and a Senate that were conservative Republicans for the first time in 140 years. So we decided to get busy doing pro-life legislation as quickly as we could, as long as we had that kind of majority in both chambers and also the governor. There was nothing stopping us. So we started out doing a woman's right to know. That was just a simple bill that says, doctor, if a woman wants to see her ultrasound, she should be able to see it. And what was really ridiculous is we required them to have them, but the abortionist was never required to show them to the mother. And we know why they didn't want them to see them, because they would see it was a baby. It is not a piece of tissue. It is not a cell. It is a baby. And so that actually, with the 72-hour wait law that we have also, that really saved about 3,500 babies a year, because they would go to the pregnancy centers to get their ultrasound. They would get counseling there. They would get help there to raise their children singly or adoption and get the counseling they need, jobs, financial support, the things that the pregnancy centers do. We don't just take them in and tell them, let's kill your baby, that's the easiest way out. Because that's what Planned Parenthood does. And I'm not afraid to say it. That's what Planned Parenthood does.
Took that government-approved speech in his hands and he held it high for all to see, and he tore it in half and set it aside, and he said these words in defiance of his government: "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." You see, Roy Costner took a stand. It's a lesson for all of us. We've got to take a stand. We cannot bow down. So consider this your call to arms. Happy warriors. We are tasked with defending a noble cause and a noble faith. Yeah, we've taken a few sucker punches. The enemies of freedom, yeah, they've got us surrounded. And no doubt that our numbers, they might be dwindling just a smidge. But we're still in the light. Because we're Americans. A lot of people have been asking me, Todd, what do you think about impeachment? Well, sweet mercy, the Democrats have been trying to impeach Donald Trump before he even announced that he was running for president. I don't know who you supported back in 2016, but I want to tell you about who I supported. I supported a man who promised to defend religious liberty, to protect the unborn. I supported a man who vowed to secure our borders and restore the federal courts. I supported a man who promised to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I plan to vote for the man who delivered on those promises. And I plan on casting my vote in 2020 for President Donald J. Trump.
We are going to reconvene at 7:30. We're going to give you plenty of time to relax, have some dinner.